When you think of London, what comes to mind? Probably Big Ben, right? Maybe the Tower. But to really get what makes London, well, London, you have to look past all that. You have to see the raw logic, the brutal engineering, and the absolute disasters that shaped its DNA.
Because that's the real story here. It's not just about a city that got bigger over time. No, this is a city that was repeatedly utterly obliterated and then forced to come back smarter and stronger. It's an incredible story of resilience, and it's etched right into the streets themselves.
All right, so where does this story even begin? Well, it doesn't start with a king's grand vision or a beautiful vista. It starts with a cold, hard calculation made by Roman military engineers. They didn't pick this spot for the view. They chose it because it was strategically perfect.
And this term, lowest bridging point, this is the whole key. Think about what the Romans needed. They needed a place on the River Thames that was just narrow enough to build a bridge for their armies to cross. But at the same time, it had to be far enough downstream so that big seagoing ships from Europe could sail right up to it. It was the perfect fusion of military might and economic opportunity.
It's pretty amazing when you see how all these natural features just lined up. You had two solid gravel hills sitting above the marshy clay, perfect for defense. You had a freshwater stream flowing right through the middle, creating a natural sheltered harbor. And it was all happening right where the tide stopped pushing upstream. It was the ideal bottleneck to control everything moving by land and sea in southern Britain.
And here's the real kicker, the political masterstroke. This perfect spot, it also happened to be a kind of contested border zone between rival tribes. It was basically a blank slate. So unlike other places that were already important tribal capitals, the Romans could just roll in and build their city, their way, from the ground up, for their own purposes.
Okay, so they've got the perfect spot. Now what? Well, now they had to turn this strategic location into a permanent symbol of Roman power. And that meant engineering on a scale that was just massive, starting with the bridge that would become the absolute lifeline for the new province.
You see, the first London Bridge wasn't just a way to get across the river, it was a military machine. Roman engineers pounded these enormous water-resistant timbers deep into the riverbed. Then they protected the base of each pier with these clever rubble-filled cages called starlings that would break up the force of the current. The result was this incredibly robust all-weather highway that connected their entire road network. It meant legions could move fast. Just think about that number for a second, 100,000 tons. That's how much stone they figured they needed to build the city's defensive wall, a project that would define the shape of London for more than 1,000 years.
And this is where you really see the Roman mindset in action. The local ground was just clay, totally useless for building a massive wall. So what do? They just create a massive supply chain to barge all that stone up the river from Kent. You know, the wall wasn't just for defense. It was a statement. It was a declaration that said, we are Rome, and we are here to stay.
But that idea of permanence, well, it was about to be put to the test. Big time. In this next section, we're going to see how London's story became defined by fire, by total destruction, and by the innovative new rules that literally rose from the ashes. You have to understand, twice in its history, London was almost completely wiped off the map. The first time, it was a systematic, targeted destruction during Queen Boudicca's rebellion. And then, 16 centuries later, the Great Fire just tore through the dense wooden maze of the medieval city. This pattern, this cycle of total destruction, is absolutely crucial to understanding the London we see today.
I mean, that first destruction was so total that archaeologists can literally dig down today and still find it. There's this thick, red scar of burnt clay and ash buried right under the modern city. It's physical proof of a city burned to the ground, a literal layer of destruction in its geology.
So what happened after the Great Fire of 1666? This is the moment everything changes. Because this time, the rebuilding wasn't just about putting up new structures. It was about inventing new systems. The Rebuilding Act demanded fireproof materials, brick or stone only. It classified all houses into 4 standard types to control density. It ordered wider streets and banned those overhanging jetties to stop fires from jumping from house to house. This was the birth of modern urban planning, and it was born directly out of catastrophe.
So as London grows and rebuilds, this really unique, almost fractured identity starts to form. For centuries, it really wasn't one single city, but 2 very distinct and often competing centers of power existing right next to each other.
On one side, you have the ancient city of London, that square mile, which is the direct descendant of Roman Londinium. That became the hub of money, of finance, of commerce. And then, just a little ways up the river, you have Westminster, which grew up around the royal court and parliament. That became the center of political power. It's truly a tale of two cities, the engine of finance and the seat of government.
And this created this fascinating tension that lasted for centuries. The king always needed the city's money to fund wars and run the country, but the fiercely independent city needed the king's protection and the stability that came from a strong government to do business. This codependent rivalry really shaped the political landscape of England for ages.
All right, let's fast forward to the 19th century. This dual-hearted city has now become the engine of the largest empire in history. But that immense prosperity, all that wealth, was built on a foundation of soul-crushing inequality and pretty ruthless exploitation. So let's look at the massive growth and the human cost that came with it.
The Victorian era is when the docklands just exploded. These huge, secure basins were built one after another to handle the flood of goods coming in from all over the world. Sugar, tea, timber, you name it. They were the physical proof of London's new status as the world's bank and its warehouse, completely transforming the city's eastern side into a global economic machine. But here's the dark reality of how that machine worked. It ran on something called the casual labor system, which was just institutionalized misery. There were no steady jobs. Imagine this, every single day, thousands of desperate men would crowd around the dock gates, just hoping to get picked by a foreman for a few hours of backbreaking work. If you weren't picked, you went home with nothing. It created whole neighborhoods defined by poverty and sheer uncertainty.
In this quote from the time, it just cuts right to the bone. It perfectly captures the dehumanizing nature of the whole system. These weren't employees. They were treated like livestock, with their entire family's fate for the day decided by the whim of one guy.
But a system like that can only last for so long before people fight back. In 1889, the dock workers organized one of the most important strikes in British history. Their demands were simple: a basic minimum wage, the docker's tanner, and a guaranteed few hours of work if they were chosen. And they won. Their victory was a massive turning point. It sparked a whole new era of social reform and forced the city to finally confront its dark, hidden reality.
So when you pull back and look at the whole story, you realize that London is like a palimpsest. You know, one of those old manuscripts where new text is written over the faint traces of the old. The Roman engineering is a layer. The Great Fires regulations are another layer. The Victorian exploitation and the reforms that it sparked, that's another layer. Each crisis, each disaster provided the blueprint for whatever came next. And that leaves us with a really fascinating thought, doesn't it? London's entire history shows us that cities are fundamentally shaped by how they respond to failure. So as we face our own modern crises, economic, environmental, social, it makes you wonder, what kind of city are we building for the future?